Robin Shepard. His work as Executive Director for the North Central Cooperative Extension Association includes representing member universities at the regional and federal levels with partners and policymakers. He currently has an appointment as Associate Professor in the Department of Life Science Communications at UW-Madison. Beyond his primary academic and administrative responsibilities, Robin is perhaps better known for his beer writing, his historic brewery walks of Madison and Milwaukee, beer dinners and tastings, and numerous presentations on brewing and industry trends. He's actually leaving for Germany soon to do one of those. It's very exciting. You can find much of his writing in the Isthmus. Robin has titled today's speech, Wisconsin Craft Beers 101. He's going to tell us about the historical context of brewing in Wisconsin, trends and challenges in Wisconsin's current craft brewing industry. And he will talk about flavor trends and what to look for as you pursue your own perfect pint. And after today's speech, Robin will be holding a beer tasting for members and their guests who registered in advance to attend the tasting. So we thank Robin for holding that. So we look forward to your presentation, Robin, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thanks. So there will be time at the end for questions, and we will have microphones circulating. So at this time, let's welcome Robin to the stage.
I think that was the first time that I've ever been at a group that began the meeting singing the Beer Barrel Polka. It just was so fitting. There was a point, though, there's a line in there about, we've got the Blues on the run. Well, I'm a big, huge Brewers fan, and I just instinctively said, we've got the Cubs on the run. So I apologize to Cub fans who might have heard that outburst. Well, when you think about beer, when you think about when you travel across the country and someone asks you where you're from, what's the first thing that sort of comes to mind in that conversation? Hosting cows, milk and cheese, maybe the Green Bay Packers. Eventually you get around to maybe the Brewers, greatest sports name in history. And then there's the beer itself, right? And depending upon who you're talking to and your own perspective, there's any order to those that might actually happen. There's really a certain pride that we take here in Wisconsin about knowing, about beer and knowing about the history that's associated with beer here in Wisconsin. It was breweries nearly a century and a half ago, like Miller and Schlitz, Blatz, G. Heilman. Those were the folks that, had the grist, the sweat, the suds that made us the beer state, right? That was really where we got our early beginnings. I mean, we were brewing beer in this state before we were actually a state, believe it or not. Our first brewery was in the 1830s, all the way down in the Mineral Point area. Today, though, if you fast forward, it's not exactly the 1800s anymore when you think about craft beer, especially the modern movement of it. I think back about growing up in northern Missouri, a very conservative area. My father would come home. This was Budweiser territory where I grew up in, and he would come home, and maybe it was after those Thursday night Rotary meetings, and kick back in his favorite living room chair and open that red and white can with the bow tie. You know what I'm talking about? We've come a long way since then. Those big breweries are still, in essence, who drives the juggernaut of beer production and purchasing sales in this country and in the world, for that matter. But there's a growing segment of craft beer enthusiasts. There's a culture that really surrounds that. If you think about it, when you go into your favorite restaurant, tavern, bar, and you sit down, if you go to a restaurant, you open up the menu, it's remarkable today that you'll find such a commitment to a beer page, a beer menu. I guess part of my role here today is to help you, give you some inspiration for deciphering all of that you're seeing happen before your eyes. It's not just enough that you walk in and you see beer on the menu. In Wisconsin, it's about seeing good beer on the menu. It's also about taking pride in really what we drink. You know, for those who get excited about the intensity, the fascination with craft beer, I used to think my rite of passage in Wisconsin was having, you know, 2 canoes in my garage that I hardly ever used. You know, being a water state with 15,000 lakes. Well, now it's kind of, it's really turned on its head a little bit. We have a greater number of beer stores than we do boat stores in Madison anymore. And I don't want to really stir up an argument between paddle sports and beer drinkers, but you know, if Anheuser-Busch and Miller pooled all of their liquid assets in 2 years, they would produce enough beer that you could fill Lake Monona, believe it or not. Now, if you're a beer person, you understand my math, but we'll move on, okay? Craft beer people are as passionate about beer as sports teams and those sports fanatics and the stats on your favorite players. I've written for Isthmus about 12 or 13 years on a regular basis, and Isthmus used to do a little tally count on its stories about the most popular stories for any given day. And this is sort of a snapshot to give you an idea of sort of where does beer rank. And if you look just closely, number 1 is about beer, number 3 is about beer, and number 5 is about beer. Technically, number 4 includes beer because it's about dining and drinks. The only thing that gets in the way here is sex, and it's at number 2, believe it or not. There is a sort of a love affair that we're seeing happen in the beer world today. It's not the beer, the sort of the premium brands that we grew up. Obviously, they're still in more than the background. They're the dominant in terms of market players, but there's this intensity that you're seeing in our communities from those earlier slides that I showed you about the beer festival craze to beer dinners. You know, the menus are evolving. Festivals themselves, you see them oriented around beer, but you also see festivals now emerging that are more upper level events where it's all about food and pairing. There's a wonderful network of Savor events, one that's held every summer in Washington, D.C., where they bring out very few select breweries, but they pair them with some of the city's best chefs. And it's always held in a historic building in Washington, D.C. It's quite a wonderful way to experience the taste, the flavors of what beer is about in modern times. Let's back up just a little bit and think about what brought beer here to Wisconsin, understanding a little bit of the pretense for how we became such a beer state and how this influences today's beer culture. You know, Wisconsin was really a beer land before we referred to it as the dairy land, believe it or not. Pre-settlement days, we had the natural resources that were all there to be that initial catalyst for an industry like brewing to take place. The green that you see is massive forest lands. We had rich soils for growing barley. The forests themselves were valuable because in the early days we didn't do aluminum and stainless steel kegs, did we? We did wooden casks to store the beer. And not to mention the water resources that are rich here in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region. Water is not only important for brewing the beer, but in the 1800s it provided the ice. They would brew the beer in the cooler months of the year, and they would wrap it in sawdust, burlap, and ice and store it for the warm summer months. That wasn't the only thing that really contributed to making us the beer state. There were the immigration patterns that happened as well. Between 1836 and 1850, Wisconsin's population increased from 11,000 up to nearly 200,000. Some of the settlers obviously were from the eastern U.S., but enormous number of those immigrants came from Europe. We had recruiters that were actually working Europe. We had a number of kiosks and things that would attract them here to Wisconsin because Germany and Wisconsin look a lot alike, believe it or not, with that wonderful rolling hillside and topography. By 1850, 1/3 of the state's population was foreign-born. Of those non-English speaking immigrants, Germans were by far the most numerous. This early immigration pattern, particularly from Germany, not only brought a lot of people from where beer was part of the lifestyle, but it also brought us a lot of our early brewers and brewery apprentices that helped us establish brewing in the 1800s. That in and of itself is often why you hear us refer to this as the Renaissance of local brewing, because brewing sort of began to take a dip about right shortly after Prohibition. We never had as many breweries after Prohibition until about 2005. We started with about 85 or so when we came back from Prohibition. Those numbers dwindled to just 8 by the early 1980s. Where are we today? This is part of that intensity in the beer movement, the beer culture that you see in Madison and all across the country for that matter. Here in the Midwest region, around the Great Lakes, there are probably more than about 350 to 380 working breweries and brew pubs. Those numbers change just about daily. There's 150 microbreweries and about 25 to 30 what we call regional brewers that are a little larger in size. Now, you'll find a lot of wonderful beer styles as well in this region of the country, primarily because of those early immigration patterns and a thirst for different types of beers. If you think about Wisconsin numbers, well, it's a hard industry to track. It barely fits on a page anymore. I've been tracking the industry for about 20 years, and even in this sort of stage, you get to a point where I can't track them. I can't hardly read them all if I put them on one page. What's the industry doing right now? Well, today's brewery numbers across the U.S. are at their highest level ever. That's right. We have more breweries as of this day than we have had in any day in history. And that trend, if you look at the right side of that, the slope of that line continues to be in that type of trajectory. The Brewers Association, who tracks the numbers, reported last year that there were 547 breweries that opened in the U.S. in 2015. Now, you do that math. That's 1.5 breweries per day are opening. 1.5 in 2015. The 2016 early numbers are looking close to 2 breweries a day are opening right now. Okay? There are 15 states in the country that have more than 100 breweries working in them right now. Wisconsin, obviously, is one of those. If you look at by the numbers, California, where you would kind of expect that, California was a little late to the game in terms of the modern craft brew movement, but they rank number 1 with over 500 local breweries. Wisconsin comes in at about number 14 with about 140, depending upon how and what you count, which is another lecture in and of itself, just sort of what classifies as a brewery these days. In terms of beer production, despite those big increases in numbers, the amount of beer that's being produced in the United States is actually declining. A lot of reasons for that. The foremost are the interest in healthy lifestyles, food choices, the choices in non-alcoholic drinks, and yes, also the really harsh realities of what alcohol can bring in the way of challenges to society. The crackdown in driving under the influence, again, another major reason why we're seeing less beer produced and less beer actually consumed. The average per person consumption right now across the United States is about 28 gallons of beer a year. Looking around the room, some of you are maybe in that category, most of you not. Per capita in Wisconsin right now is about 36 gallons. You know, if we look at the list of 1 through 50, it's kind of a dubious list, right? But we're number 6 on that list. Number 1, I'm not sure you really want to be number 1 on this list. So, number 1 is North Dakota with 43 gallons per person. Utah is number 50. They're at 19 gallons. Even Utah has a sizable number there. Let's think about the beer market itself for a moment. This is craft beer. This is what all the excitement is. This is what you see those people, you know, standing out overnight looking for great taste tickets or, you know, getting excited about Isthmus Beer and Cheese in the dead of winter going out to drink beer, you know. This really reflects the modern craft beer movement. It, too, is on this tremendous curve. This is really where the growth is occurring. The big guys are seeing their sales go down. The market share of craft brewing in the United States is around 12.8%. In money terms, that's about $23 billion a year out of a $105 billion industry. Madison, it reflects some growth as well. If we think about the sort of the numbers of breweries, the excitement that you see here locally, Madison has really become quite a thriving beer nirvana of its own. I mean, it rivals cities like Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, San Diego, California. Those are all sort of beer meccas in the craft beer world. And Madison right now, if you go out and to have a beer at your favorite tavern or local bar, if you look across that back bar at all those tap handles, for every 10 tap handles you see, 7 of them are going to be local breweries. The days when you walk in and you just saw both kinds of beer, Miller and Bud, you know, that's not exactly what you see now anymore. In fact, Madison, the distributors say that we're probably hovering around 30% craft beer sales overall. That's a big number when you think about 30% of the beer across the bar is a craft beer entity. Considering that that number was 0 in 1985. That leads us to, well, what are we drinking today? If you think about the craft beer segment, the slice of that, let me back up. First of all, in beer terms, it's not just one kind of beer. Let me leave you with that message before you vacate today. There are 140 some different styles of beer today. I love to tease my wine buddies that, you know, there are really only about 30 wines we care about. Probably upset a few of you. I hope not. But, you know, in the world right now, the Pilsner still ranks number 1. That's the flavor that you get when you buy one of the big guys, all right? But IPAs, those hop-driven, bitter, resiny, piney, grapefruit, citrusy kinds of things, that's all the rage today. The changes that you see in the local taps, the local breweries across the craft beer industry are really this sort of reflect a quest for new flavors in today's drinkers. There are other kinds of things that we see, trends and you know, from clothing to other foods. So beer is really in some ways no different when you think about it on that level. But you could go a little deeper. Here's some of the things that I see in today's industry that I didn't even see necessarily 10 years ago. This idea, the quest for sour beers. These are beers that are intentionally made to be tart and sour. I can remember 20 years ago, a good friend got married, and he asked me to brew a beer for him. And so I figured, well, wedding, God, this would be great. I'm going to make him the most spectacular German Hefeweizen, a wheat beer. It'd be great for a summer wedding, standing outside in the hot sun. And lo and behold, about the day before, you know, the old big event got going, I tapped it, and it was sour. It was terrible. I hope that wasn't an indication of what would happen later in life for him and his wife, but that's another story too. The fact of that, why I tell you this story, is that was in 1990, and I think about that beer, and that sour flavor was so bad. Today, I would be selling that in the Great Dane like nobody's business. That's the kind of transformation that we have made. Sour beers are those that really, we've really spent a lot of our science inertia in the last 5 years thinking about how to use wild yeast, bacteria, lactobacillus, you know, the funky sour stuff you get in yogurt, or wild yeast strains, things that will intentionally make a beer sour. Things that 5-7 years ago, brewers did all they could to clean the place so that they didn't have their place infected by those. The other thing that really gets put out in the forefront are hoppy beers, those that are bitter. And it's just not enough to say that I like IPAs or I like bitter beers anymore. The hoppy beer crowd has really, the hopheads as we call them, have really gotten into the shades of gray. They no longer just want a beer that's bitter. If you sit down next to some of these young men and women at the bar and listen to them, they're dissecting what type of hops actually go in that beer, believe it or not. And some of them are quite good at pulling out those essence of either, is it sort of tropical with the grapefruit and the orange, or is it the kind of what we call the West Coast style that's resiny and piney kind of flavors? Malty beers, malt gives the beer its fermentable sugars. It gives the beer its strength. And so big beers are quite the rage as well. How big is big? Well, beers can fall anywhere regularly from 6 to 10% alcohol. Wine is usually around 13. That gives you kind of a benchmark. But we see some really fascinating exercises in brewers' art and science that are pushing beers clearly into the double-digit types of areas. Barrel aging is another thing that, you know, we saw the barrel aging of pre-prohibition. we've now returned to a lot of that. Only what we're seeing in the beer industry is that brewers are using used barrels. They're not new. They'll go to the Bourbon Trail, Kentucky, and bring back bourbon barrels. There's a gentleman here in Madison that really is kind of the barrel baron. He goes and makes a regular trip to Kentucky, loads up a flatbed trailer with barrels, comes back up here and sells them to the local brewers. And he does that periodically, as in about every other month. There are now barrel brokers across this country that will resell bourbon barrels. Now there's a huge market for rum, tequila barrels, wine barrels, you name it. Scott Manning, the brewer at Vintage, about 6 months ago, took a wonderful barley wine that had already been aging for about a year, already had a lot of alcohol in it, probably 11, 12%, and stuck it in an absinthe barrel. Absinthe, think about licorice, anise, and what that might do to a beer. Now, granted, that's a very acquired taste, right? But that gives you an idea that we're sort of pushing the envelope a little bit in even how we define beer today. But beer at its roots is pretty simple. 4 basic ingredients: water, barley, hops, and yeast. It doesn't get much more simple than that. And it's amazing that you take those 4 basic ingredients and you go a little more of this, a little less of that, a little different way of preparing the malt, a little different yeast, and you get over 140 different styles today. Now, as early as the 1980s, there really were, I joke a little bit about the big breweries, and that's sort of a cheap shot from a beer geek like me. The big breweries have really paved the way for all of this to happen. The collapse in much of the 50s, 60s, and 70s leading up to the 80s was all around competition over premium beer. And so what happened is that it really became a super hyper-competitive niche that they tried to define, and they ended up gobbling each other up. Fast forward to today, and now brewers have gone from the standard premium beers to really using those 4 basic ingredients. Let me give you a quick whirlwind of some of those beers that fit these trends. This is the so-called strongest beer in the world. It actually pushes the definition of beer because it uses some different kinds of sugars to get a 28% alcohol limit. This is Sam Adams Utopia. It's sold in, if you look there on the left, it's a flask that looks like a lauter ton. It sells for $200. Okay? Here's the guys in the Great Dane. The Great Dane was the first brew pub here in Madison. They tried to emulate that with their own strong beer. They teamed up with Kirby Nelson, who's now works, he's the brewmaster, legendary, famous as much as he is infamous amongst beer drinkers. And they tried to break their own record. They produced a version of 13, almost 14% alcohol. I said that hops are kind of the where it's at right now in terms of the popularity of things. Hops don't just come in one size. Now we're getting into designer hops. Ellis Island produced a beer last spring that was made with a hop that imparts a white wine-like flavor. Okay? And then there's heritage hops. Just north of here in Sun Prairie, a gentleman on his father's farm discovered an old variety of hops growing in the fence line. They were able to cultivate that and begin to harvest it. Next thing he knew, he had brewers knocking on his door. The Pearl Street Brewery in La Crosse bought all of his hops proprietary just for them to make this beer for 3 years. And then there's guys like I mentioned, Scott Manning, who is almost a chef in the brew house. And he uses some really interesting types of adjuncts. In this case, he has a hibiscus saison made with, you guessed it, flower petals. The breweries that use barrels, this is an example of barrel aging from Lexington, Kentucky. It's co-located with a distillery, quite handy if you're looking for barrels. New Glarus, we all know Spotted Cow, right? That's an iconic beer in terms of the craft movement in Wisconsin. What people don't realize is that New Glarus was actually one of the first in the entire United States to really start looking at sour beer production in the mid-1990s. It took its old brewery and turned that into a lambic-style brew house. And his fruit beers now are really, in my world, they're beer currency. I can trade those because you can't get New Glarus beer outside of Wisconsin. I'll travel with a bottle of Wisconsin Belgian Red, and I will trade that for some awesome stuff. I once swapped it out with a brewer in Colorado, believe it or not. I mean, it cost me, about $9 a bottle, but he was so gracious and just loved the beer because he couldn't get it in Colorado. He gave me a $55 bottle of Imperial Porter. I got by far the better end of the deal. That's why I say it's beer currency. I could go on and on about that's one of the most asked questions I get when I travel is not about Spotted Cow, it's about Dan Carey's fruit beers. And then there are the really small guys that make all this hobby fun. These are the guys that are kind of brewing in the back of a restaurant somewhere. Jim Gronison up at the Parched Eagle, north part of Madison, in the Westport area. He opened his brewery about 3 years ago. He's making beer at about 2 to 3 barrels at a time. A barrel is about 32 gallons. In a week, he's lucky if he kind of turns out maybe, at the most, maybe 6 barrels. He brews about every other day. You know what Miller turns out in a year? 100 million barrels across its 8 breweries in the United States. Okay? So that's what makes it fun. Miller and the other big guys this has not gone unnoticed, this trend for craft beer. When you go into your favorite grocery store, liquor store, it's pretty hard these days to understand what fits in this craft beer movement and what's sort of behind that label. That's for the purist who define craft in terms of hyper-local. It's got to be a certain size or less type of brewery. It's got to be made with non-fermentable adjuncts. It can't be made with corn or rice kind of stuff. That's the real serious beer person's definition of craft brewing. I mean, I would argue with anybody that Leinenkugel's is craft, by the way. But the idea here is that the big guys have started looking at some of the big players in the craft beer movement and we're going to sort of snatch them off and become part of our umbrella. Miller did that with Leinenkugel's in the mid-1990s. 5 years ago, Anheuser-Busch reached down to Chicago, Goose Island, a wonderful local little micro brew pub, and lo and behold, they're now part of the AB family. Well, let me end with a couple of thoughts just in terms of, this, despite what you might have learned in your 20s or in college, it's not a game of how much you can drink. The movement really is about the quality of the beverage, that variety of flavors. And also, I really believe that it's not just about what's in the glass. Beer is about the experience that you have when you're enjoying it, who you're with, what you're doing, as well as what that glass is about. That's what makes it sort of that wonderful communal type of beverage. Why don't I take a few questions? Any thoughts? Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning good craft beer. What is your criteria for good craft beer? The other question was this one. You also mentioned lactobacillus in the sour beers, which seems to be a very healthy component. Those two questions. Yeah. What is good craft beer, and what is lactobacillus in the IPA or the sour beers?
Well, lactobacillus is a bacteria, and it's what gives yogurt. It's sourness, and that's what brewers have figured out. If we put that in, I'll get that sour, that tart flavor. Is it more healthy than other beers? I don't think I'm qualified to answer that particular question, but it's clearly a trend. Lactobacillus is one way to go. There are different types of wild yeast strains that also give beers that. Your other question about what makes a good beer, whatever I have in my hand at the same time, I mean, I've never found a beer I shouldn't say that. I have found beers that I wasn't happy with, but that's what really makes this fun and about drinking it today, is that you have so many choices that you can define good of what you like. Like I said earlier, this is really, for me, drinking is not just about what's in the glass. I started this 15, 17, 18 years ago. I became one of those beer scavenger hunters. It sounds almost as an insult when you walk into a brewmaster, and I've caught myself doing this. So what do you got new for me today? What haven't I had? What's not on my list? I'm like a birder. I have this life beer list. And, if you think about that, that's what sort of drives me. So I'm always looking for new flavors. I love history when it combines. I mean, I love going into the Old Fess Hotel where the Great Dane is and just sort of soaking up that wood environment, and thinking about what life was like here in the 1870s. That's how I define a good beer. It's the entire experience. Now, there are other people that are strict, kind of what we call the beer style police. That's the guys that take not just the 140, but there's another subset of probably about 70 of those beers that are really hardcore competitively judged, and it has to be right. I mean, they'll hold up a little color card, and oh, this is SRM 6. Oh, it should be SRM 2. That's not good. So, you know, there's that kind of, you could do that, and more power to them. Oftentimes those are really kind of the really technical homebrew kinds of folks. But beer really should be defined good in terms of what you like, what it does for you.
I have a question about serving. What is the temperature beer should be to serve? Should the glass be frosted? And is there a particular kind of glass that serves beer better?
You should see my cupboard at home. Christy and I have a beer glass collection that's is not just logos. In fact, I don't like logoed glasses today. I have, I think, probably about 30 different styles of beers. If you pick up Isthmus, you'll see me rotate those through. Many beer styles should be enjoyed really in specific glasses for the purist in me. That's where I start becoming maybe a little obsessive compulsive, is that, you know, if I want a good, you know, Scottish ale, I'm going to put it in a thimble. If I want a Pilsner, I want a Pilsner glass. If I'm drinking a great German Oktoberfest, like I'm going to do in 2 weeks, bragging, I want that in a Krug. You know, one of those great big marbled glass. You know, I want to feel the weight of that glass with that Oktoberfest, you know. So that's part of the experience that makes beer good. So as to cold and frosted, again, it depends what the beer is. If you want to bring out the bitterness of a beer, serve it really cold. That'll accentuate the hops. If you love sweetness, let it go to room temperature. Even let it go a little on the flat side, and you'll be amazed at what happens. The malt just kind of like begins to filter up, and you'll get the caramels and the chocolates. All that will emerge with a warmer glass. So frosted glasses take it maybe a little bit too far, and maybe I've taken this a little too far.
I know Robin will be around for questions if you have more. So thank you so much, and this meeting's adjourned.